before I jump in, I have a bit of info to communicate as well. And I realized just as I was getting up to jump into this last service that we're made a lot of like announcements, and it's April 1st. And so some of you might be going like, how much of this can we really believe? But we weren't clever enough to get ahead of that and throw in some goofy like fake news in there too. So the deal like that Wade had mentioned about, you know, Corey stepping off and Stephen Thiessen being the chair, like that's legit. That wasn't even that funny, right? So that was, and so I'm going to give you some true information about next weekend because it's Easter weekend coming up. We're doing our services a little bit differently. And so we're trying to communicate the plan, and so some of you are like, we know this. It's been online, it's been in the newsletter, it's been in the bulletin. You're right, absolutely. And some of you know it better than I do, but for some of us, it bears repeating. So I'll spell it out. And again, this is on the insert in your bulletin today. But this coming week, this coming Friday is Good Friday, and we're going to have a service together here at 6:30 p.m. It'll be one service. We're going to be meeting in the gathering place, and I think it's going to be different, but I think it's going to be good. We're doing something different with the seating. It's going to be very centered around the cross, and the service itself is going to be kind of stripped down, more acoustic and somber. I want us to really reflect on the weight of the cross, and sort of contrast Good Friday with Resurrection Sunday. And so that's happening. Good Friday, we'll be taking communion together as well in the gathering place at 6:30. Easter Sunday, we're having two services here at the church, but I want you to note the times are shifting slightly. The second service is going to be a little bit later. So instead of 9 o'clock and 10:45, it's going to be 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock. And just that little bit of extra breathing room, hopefully to allow people in the first to, you know, we like to hang out and visit and take our time, but go, and then we can do the cleanup and reset and get ready for the next service, because the service is going to be happening Easter Sunday morning in the gathering place as well, but we're going to be seated around tables similar to Christmas Eve if you were here with us. And we're going to be eating together, not after the service, but actually first thing, like during the service. We're wanting to have kind of an Easter potluck, think brunch kind of thing. And so we invite you to come and to bring some food to share. And, you know, if you've got like a really awesome Easter brunch, you know, hash brown casserole thing that'll just knock our socks off, like now's your time to shine. Or if you're like, I just like a big vat of scrambled eggs, that's good too. However you don't need me to tell you, right? Although cinnamon toast would not be a bad, I'm coming up with ideas now. If you chat with me after, if you're not sure. I must be getting hungry. But yeah, it's going to be a potluck. We're going to be eating together around tables in kind of the first half-ish of the service. And I'll be speaking kind of during that part. We'll have a kind of a stage at this end of the room. And then after we're done eating and after we're going to kind of transition into worship in response, celebrating the resurrection of our Lord. And so just a couple of things to keep in mind. Seating is limited. Obviously, we don't have infinite seats, and being around tables means that there's slightly less than infinite. And so we have a registration online, and that's really just to help you avoid disappointment, because you can go on and you can see kind of how full the services are, so that there should be room for everybody, but not if we all come to the same service, right? So we'll try and spread ourselves out a little bit. That should be good. And also for the potluck, we anticipate there will be guests, and we encourage you to invite, if you've got family that you're like, well, I always invite them to church with us on Easter Sunday. Great, that's awesome. Bring them along. But there will probably be guests, and there might be some of our regular folks that just try as we might, they missed the memo, and they're going to show up on Sunday, not with food, and going, what? It was a potluck. I'll go get something. No, we're eating right now. Oh, what? Is there enough for me? And I want us to say, absolutely, we brought tons. That's a potluck. There's always tons. But just bring enough to share. And yeah, what else? We're not going to run our regular kids program next week. So the kids from kind of kindergarten to grade 5 are invited to stay with us at the tables. I've done an extensive survey, and kids love breakfast, and so I think they're going to be fans. We're going to have some coloring and activity pages and crayons that you can grab if needed. We're going to have nursery and preschool available downstairs for the littles, and we can just kind of do what we have to do. But it'll be family style, and I think it'll be really good. Look forward to seeing as many of you there as can make it, and I think I've covered all the facts. If you're like, I have a real big question about it, you want to get a hold of Danny Goldenthal at the office during the week. You don't ask me. I will further muddy the waters, okay? This is as clear as it's going to get from me. But feel free to contact the church if you got more questions. Okay. Excuse me. All of that was for free. My timer wasn't even running. We are approaching Easter, and it is such an important, such a huge, both dark and light time of the year for us as Christians. And if you have been tracking with us, you know we have been moving our way through the Gospel of Luke, kind of verse by verse, approaching Easter, really. And so this Sunday is Palm Sunday, and traditionally in churches we would talk about the triumphal entry. But because we're kind of doing the verse by verse move through, we covered that a few weeks ago, and that was a calculated risk I took. And so we're not going to be Palm Sunday themed, but we're approaching Good Friday themed this week. Think of it as a preamble. If you were with us last week, you remember we were in Luke chapter 22, kind of in the middle of the chapter, and we had talked about how Jesus had gone out to the Garden of Gethsemane. He was on the Mount of Olives. It's nighttime. He's with his disciples. He was praying. And when we left off last week, Jesus came back and he found his disciples sleeping, and he woke them up. He goes, "Why are you sleeping? Pray that you wouldn't fall into temptation." And then right as he's talking, we're going to jump into our passage for this week. We're going to be looking at Luke chapter 22, verses 47 to 71. And again, this is fairly well-known territory for folks who are familiar with the Bible at all. These stories show up in fairly similar form with slight variations in all 4 Gospels. But I want us to look and see here again. I don't want our familiarity with the story to blind us to what's going on. We're going to see, like, Jesus faced betrayal and rejection, right? He faced it from the people who should have been most supportive of him. This isn't a matter of, well, you know, as Jesus was going along, he was making some risky choices and putting strain on some relationships, and so now, well, yeah, the whole thing blew up. It's kind of like you did it to yourself. While you could see that in his relationship with the Jewish ruling authorities, everyone in this story had very good reasons to be actually loyal to and supportive of and excited about what Jesus is doing, and instead we see him facing betrayal and rejection. I wonder, you know, and I want us to look at this section with one eye on the text, but maybe one eye on the mirror. I'm not throwing accusations. I'm just saying, as I was looking at this passage this week, prepping this message, I kept seeing glimpses of myself in all of these people, that it's so easy for us to be like, oh man, Judas, Peter, these guys, right? Am I that much different? Are we that much different? I wonder if our hearts are not so different from these folks that we can't learn some things. So let's jump in. If you've got your bulletin, there's notes in there. I'm moving through pretty linearly. I'm going to look at it in kind of 5 little bites. You don't need them to follow along, but they're there. First part I want us to see is Luke 22, verses 47 to 50, and we see that Jesus was betrayed by one of the 12, one of his closest, his hand-picked kind of team of disciples. Verse 47 says, while he was still speaking, there came a crowd, and the man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He drew near to Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus said to him, Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? And when those who were around him saw what would follow, they said, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. I'll tack on verse 51 as well in this section. But Jesus said, "No more of this," and he touched the man's ear and healed him. So we see this moment of the plan coming together. We saw in earlier sections how Judas was starting to confer with the high priests and make a plan. He was watching for an opportunity to betray Jesus. And here we see it coming together. I don't think it's entirely clear. There's some mystery, I think, as we try to really get a hold of what happened that night. Judas is a bit of a mysterious character. I mean, in broad strokes, I think we have it right. He was one of Jesus' followers who betrayed Jesus. You can't explain that one away. This is not a tragic figure. This is a traitor. But I wonder sometimes, what role did Judas play in this? Why were the high priests so excited to get Judas on their team? We've got one of his guys. Now this will give us what we need. What did they need? We know, we've seen it established already in previous weeks as we've been looking at this chapter, that Jesus very intentionally established a pretty predictable pattern of behavior. Go into the temple in the day. He went to kind of the same area on the mountain at night. But I think that was part of it. Rather than try to send a spy or figure it out, Judas would know where the spot was. He would be able to lead the people that were arresting Jesus right to him. He knew the area where they camped. I think there is also a question of identification. I'm trying to remember. I was flip-flopping through the different gospel accounts so much this week. I think it's in Matthew's that it explains how Judas had said to the people, he kind of arranged the signal, the one that I go and kiss, that's the guy, arrest him. This kiss wasn't weird. It would be weird if you came up to me as a dude and kissed me, or as a lady, really, if you're not my wife. Let's just move along. This was not a completely unknown social convention in this part of the world at this time and place, but it was a sign of closeness and respect. This was not the way you greet strangers. This wasn't a, "Hey, how are you doing?" So there's a flagrancy. It's like, I'm going to demonstrate as my closeness to him. That's going to identify him. But you got to remember, this is happening in a wooded area at night, in the dark. These guys don't have flashlights, spotlights, air support with spotlights kind of thing. Furthermore, the people that are coming to arrest Jesus might not have all had a really good look at him. He was a famous figure, but how many of these people were really close? And especially if you think, okay, so there's a small group of them, probably similarly dressed. It's getting late, so they've got their outer garments on. They're all probably dark-haired guys with beards of similar build, as far as we know. So the idea of grabbing the wrong guy in the dark is a real possibility, especially if the disciples get the idea that, they're coming to arrest Jesus, and one of them's like, "I'm Jesus. No, I'm Jesus. No, I am Spartacus." Wrong movie. "I am Jesus," right? Maybe they could decoy us. Judas knows these guys. He's going to be able to identify. It's like, no, I know Jesus and John have a similar haircut, but John's a bit taller, right? Thomas limps a bit. That's how you can tell him. Judas would be able to make a positive identification better than any of these guys that were sent from the high priests. And I think also there might be an aspect of I think it would have been reasonable that some of the people going to make this arrest were concerned, can we actually get this guy, right? There's a bunch of us, they've come armed, as we're going to see, but can we? Like, Jesus is not a normal guy. But I think both Judas coming and saying, I'll hand him over to you and I'll lead him to you, Judas coming with them was sort of a helpful, if not a guarantee, at least it demonstrates that it probably wasn't a trap and that Jesus really could be arrested. I wonder, and this is not explicitly explained in Scripture, but I wonder if Judas's conversation with the religious leaders was something along the lines of, listen, I know everyone is talking about Jesus being the Messiah, but lately he has not been talking like a Messiah. He has been talking increasingly about his own death. I think he sees it's inevitable that he's going to be arrested and killed. He's not talking about bringing death to his enemies. He's talking about his own death. I believe he will come along quietly. I don't think he's the threat that we thought he might be. But any way we slice it, Judas was one of the 12 and betrayed him. And that's painful. Maybe many of you have a parallel experience. It's one thing to have somebody not shoot straight with you, rip you off in a business deal or cut you off in traffic or something. But betrayal by a close friend, like who knows your stuff, who gets past your defenses because you weren't on the defensive. They're your friend. That kind of stab in the back, not the front. If you've experienced that, you know. And Jesus experienced that. But he was not only betrayed by one of the 12, I think he was misunderstood by the other 11. Right? It says, and when those who were around him, like his other disciples, saw what would follow, when they clued in, it's like, whoa, this isn't just Judas bringing buddies, like for autographs. They're arresting Jesus. What? They're like, Lord, shall we strike with the swords? And before even waiting for an answer, out comes the cutlery and off comes a guy's ear. And Luke is kind. I misspoke last week. I said that it was Mark's gospel that names names. It's actually John. He says that it was Peter that did it, which is not a huge shocker. But what a misunderstanding, right? We saw in the last section how Jesus is giving them warnings, things are going to change, and they're like, so here's a couple of swords, is that enough? Should we get ready to fight? And Jesus is like, you're not catching on. It's not about coming to blows and establishing a kingdom by force. Has anything I've been doing up to this point given you that impression? And they're still misunderstanding, and they're like, now is it sword time, on guard, right? And Jesus has to shut down his own guys, right? He's not like, whoa, all of you people who've come to get me, put your swords down. It's like Peter's swinging around. So he stops, he shuts him down, he heals the guy's damaged ear, and he allows himself to get arrested, and then his disciples scatter. I think there's a verse in Matthew that nails it down it's just like the rest of them, when they saw what happened, fled. Like they just ran away. So the 12 people that Jesus could count on didn't come through for him in that moment. And I wonder if we see pieces of ourselves in there. Do we follow Jesus only when he is going our way, when he's kind of seeming to be agreeing, when he seems to agree with the thing that we were wanting to do anyway, but then when he's disappointing us by not doing it how we thought or when we thought, do we get upset? Do we turn on him? Do we run away? I don't think any of us signs up to be a betrayer, but betrayers happen. It gives me pause. I don't have any of you in mind if you're like, he's talking to me. He just looked at me. What are you saying? I'm not saying anything. I'm looking at me. But I just wonder. So he was betrayed by one of the 12. He was also arrested by the chief priests, and he was treated as a criminal. This whole deal. So we see Jesus said, no more of this. He touched the man's ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests and the officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness. Jesus had just earlier in the chapter said that the way he would be arrested and treated would fulfill prophecy, right? He says this prophecy has to be fulfilled, that he was numbered among the transgressors or among the rebels. He wasn't arrested on a technicality. he would be treated like a criminal, which is itself criminal because Jesus had done literally nothing wrong. But they come out against him as though they're arresting an armed bandit or an armed gang of robbers who had been hijacking pilgrims on the way into the temple or into Jerusalem for Passover. And they come out all armed. Luke describes the group in verse 47 merely as a crowd. And we see here that Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple, and the elders who had come out against him. This mob that had come to get him, there are a couple of different conceptions. I have seen some popular representations of this that have Jesus being arrested by Roman soldiers in the garden. I don't think that's the case. It uses, I think John just uses the term soldiers. I think here when it says officers of the temple, we're coming closer. We don't know a ton about this group, but there was sort of a police force. I don't know if it'd probably be too much to call them a militia under Roman rule, but there was an official group of guys who were responsible at least for security of the temple area, but they were kind of like the Sanhedrin's muscle. Now, under Roman rule, it was probably limited as to what they could get away with. But I think these are the guys that are called in, right? I mean, as powerful as the chief priests and the elders were in Jewish society, they didn't have authority to commandeer a bunch of Roman soldiers. Romans don't answer to Jewish religious leaders. Like, that just doesn't happen. And they would have been commanded by one of their own officers. Jesus is talking to the chief priests, and he says, "You've come against me as a robber with swords and clubs." You can almost hear there's a two-layered irony in this. It's almost like Jesus is going, wow, swords and clubs, really? Like, why did you come out here armed? You can picture these guys, like whatever weapon they have. They don't all have swords, but a big stick. Like, they've come expecting a fight. We don't know how many, but there's a crowd. Swords and clubs. That's both overkill and it's pathetically inadequate. It's overkill, like Jesus points out. It's like you're coming out to arrest some like known violent offender. It's me. I've been teaching in the temple every day. I'm not going around robbing people. You know where I've been. You could have come and grabbed me anytime, but you come out at night like I'm a criminal. You don't need the swords and clubs. So they're overkill, but they're also pathetically inadequate because if Jesus was concerned with defending himself, we learn in Matthew 26, verses 52 to 54, Matthew records, Jesus tells one of his disciples, when he's saying, like, put your swords away, says, do you think that I couldn't call on my Father and he would not at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? Jesus is saying, I don't need your defense. If you thought this was about, no, don't let them arrest me. It's like, I don't need your swords. I have, and I don't know if what is a legion of angels? I don't know. A legion of Roman soldiers was, what, like 3,000 troops or something? How many angels does it take to drive off? I think one would have been pretty scary, right? So Jesus is basically like, you've come out with your little sticks and your knives. Like, you don't even understand. If I did this, you would be so, like, talk about shock and awe. But Jesus goes with them and he acquiesces. He says, this is your hour and the power of darkness. It's like this hour belongs to you and the powers of darkness. There is a coming together of both the time, as the plan has moved to this moment, and the Jewish rulers with their agenda and Satan himself coming alongside. And we see we've read his influence with Judas and the way he's underlying all of these things. And Jesus is just laying it out. He basically says, like, you've come with your sticks and swords, which weren't necessary and aren't adequate to do it. I'll go with you not because you're armed, but because this is, like, you're playing your role. Like, this is your scene. It's your time. You and the powers of darkness. I'll go with you. But Jesus is still, he's in control, but he is he is giving way in this moment. He is allowing, like this is the part of the plan where evil has its day. He's arrested as a criminal. As I was thinking about that, I thought, on one hand, I've never gone and threatened Jesus with a stick, literally or figuratively. But I wonder if we can see ourselves in this scene, in that. I wonder if we sometimes bow to the pressure of the crowd and we condemn Jesus as a criminal. We condemn at least some of Jesus' teaching, some of his words, because they're not exactly politically correct. Like, we don't talk like that anymore. Do we feel the pressure to see Jesus' hard words against sin and his exclusive claims about himself as being hateful towards people, and we kind of feel like we're maybe less enamored and more embarrassed? Do we see him as a criminal? I wonder if we feel that pressure sometimes. Jesus was also denied by his most vocal follower. The stories about Judas and Peter are well known, and they're repeated in all of the Gospels. We see here in Luke 22:54-62, it says, Then they seized him and led him away, bringing him into the high priest's house, and Peter was following at a distance. And when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down among them. And then a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the light and looking closely at him, said, This man also was with him. But he denied it, saying, Woman, I do not know him. And a little later, someone else saw him and said, You also are one of them. But Peter said, Man, I am not. And after an interval of about an hour, still another insisted, saying, Certainly this man was also with them, for he too is a Galilean. But Peter said, Man, I do not know what you're talking about. And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and he wept bitterly. It's easy to see Peter as like a bit of a blowhard. Oh, he was a braggart. He talked big, and now he's being kind of humbled here. We realize, he's being taken down a peg. Peter, I think, is maybe a bit more complex than we're tempted to give him credit for sometimes. But Peter followed at a distance. It says Peter was following at a distance. Luke's gospel gives kind of a shorter account of some of these than the other gospels, but we don't get a ton of details. Where did everybody go? John lets us know that another disciple actually went with Peter. It was likely John himself was somehow in the building at the time. We don't know about the other guys. They ran away. Peter, it says, followed at a distance. I think this is maybe the worst place to be, like literally for Peter, and I think for us as well, as we'll see in a sec. Like Peter's original intent, right? To be arrested with Jesus, to stand by him boldly, unflinchingly, being condemned with Jesus, that would have been really the pinnacle of courage and loyalty. That is how Peter saw himself just hours before. I think that's who he wanted to be. But when everything blew up, maybe almost before he knew it, Peter found himself running away, and then he catches himself, and so he follows, right? But he doesn't run back up to them and be like, what am I thinking? Hold on, you guys with Jesus, I'm with Jesus. If you're going to arrest him, you have to take me too. No, go away, buddy, you're crazy. We don't want... Whose ear do I have to chop off to get arrested in this town? Take me with you, right? He didn't do that, but he followed. I want to run it, but I don't want to run away, right? I mean, the other disciples simply ran away, which was cowardly, for sure, right? Not honorable. But as far as we know, none of them put themselves in a place where they had to deny knowing Jesus, right? They run out of the garden. I don't know. They could see them running to some little farmhouse. Bum, bum, open the door. Oh, hide me. And the person's like, excuse me, what's going on? Shh, 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 shh. Who are you? What's going on? I'm one of Jesus' followers, and they just arrested him. If anyone comes, I'm not here. Give me that lampshade, right? Maybe. I don't know. They weren't lying. They were just honestly cowards. Peter's in between. What was his plan? I don't even understand. I don't know if he knew what his plan was. He was brave-ish. He got close enough, right? He was close enough to feel the heat, literally, of the fire and the danger of being, like he's hanging out with the gang that arrested Jesus. Kind of awkward, right? He's sitting around the fire roasting marshmallows with, how's your ear? I mean, how's your ear, right? Here's a disguised voice. Dude that you ear putated is sitting there. So he got close, but not so close that he couldn't run away. He wasn't in the house with Jesus. He was kind of on the fringe. And of course, when the questions came and the line was drawn, he chickened out, just as the rooster crowed. And in what is, I think, one of the strongest understatements in the story, verse 62 says, he went out and wept bitterly. I don't think it's too difficult to see ourselves in this story, maybe. Do we follow at a distance? Like we claim utter, unwavering, unshaking loyalty while we're around other believers, right? Because there's no threat and there's actually kind of credibility to be gained. But when we are amongst Jesus' enemies and someone wonders if we're with him, you're not one of those people, are you? Are we careful to avoid seeming too weird to our unsaved friends and neighbors? Too much of a Jesus enthusiast? What is our plan when we're like that? How do we think we will do when the accusations come, when something is said or done that actually forces us to pick a side? It's common human misconception that courage is the kind of thing that you save up so you'll have lots of it when the moment comes and you need to act brave. Courage doesn't work like that. Courage is like a muscle. If you want to be really brave, when the moment to be really brave comes, you have to practice being a little bit brave in the little bit dangerous situations. This is coming from a veteran chicken, okay? I know how it's supposed to go. I just don't do it very consistently. But are we that different from Peter? I think it's a good thing to ask ourselves. Next, we see that Jesus was mocked and beaten by his own countrymen, the people whose hopes of a Messiah were right in front of them. Verse 63 says, now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking, prophesy, who is it that struck you? And they said many other things against him, blaspheming him. These are the same guys that, as far as we know, they're probably part of the contingent that went to get him, right? They need Judas to lead the way and make sure it's okay, and they're going to bring the biggest stick they can carry because we're not quite sure what we're dealing with Jesus, right? We've heard things. People have seen, this is not a normal guy. But now that he's not in the dark, now that he's not surrounded by his friends or surrounded by the adoring crowd in the middle of the temple, now that he's in the house of the high priest, or the high priest's father-in-law, who was also a high priest, it's complicated, having been arrested, well, he's just human. He's just a guy. And I think, as they increase in their boldness, as they kind of poke and mock and press their advantage, Jesus doesn't defend himself, and they horribly misinterpret what that means. As I said, there's some confusion about the groups that we're dealing with. I'm trying to remember if it's Matthew or John's gospel. Jesus had this is the part where he is being held by the Jewish authorities. The Romans haven't gotten involved yet. The people beating up Jesus here are not Romans. They'll get their turn. These were Jewish people. One of the strongest pieces of evidence is this thing that they say in verse 64. It says, they blindfolded him and kept asking him, prophesy, who is it that struck you? That is a uniquely Jewish thing to say to a Messiah claimant. Isaiah, it's based on an interpretation of Isaiah 11, verse 3, which I don't have printed here, but it essentially says, speaking of the Messiah who would come. He will not judge what he sees by what he sees with his eyes or what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness and justice will he judge my people. And so that gave rise to this idea that the Messiah, some would say, he'll be blind. At least he won't need to use his eyes and ears. It actually, I don't know how true it was. It was referenced in a couple of things I read. You can dig it up if you're a history nerd. There was a guy who was executed as a false Messiah because he couldn't judge who was who by smell. I guess they thought if the Messiah is not going to judge with his eyes or his ears, he'll have a really good, it's ridiculous. But this idea of blindfolding him, oh, you're the Messiah? Okay, which one of us was that? Tell us which one hit you. The Romans will mock him differently. They'll say, oh, you're a king, hail. They'll put a crown and a robe on him. They'll put a staff in his hand and then beat him with it. This is Jewish mockery. This is, oh, you say you're the Messiah, we don't believe you. It's so close to home, right? And they are misunderstanding his silence and his just taking it as evidence that they're right. He can't actually do anything. You've heard the phrase, right? Don't poke the bear. This is so was Jesus sitting there going, how many more times are they going to punch me in the nose before? Look, maybe one legion of angels. Just give me a squad. Give me a squad of angels. Right? No, he, with incredible patience and grace. And I wonder sometimes if that's us. It's certainly the way our unbelieving society tends to treat Jesus, but do we mock Jesus by being overly familiar with him? Have we misunderstood his incredible patience and grace as a sign of weakness and lack of power? Do we treat him as someone who is without consequence? I wonder if we don't do that, if we sometimes, do we demand that Jesus prove himself? Prove, if you are who you say you are, prove it by providing miraculous signs on command. If you're really, oh God, Jesus, if you are who you say you are, you'll whatever, heal my friend or get me this job or make her notice me or whatever. We just cover his eyes, prophesy. Psh, who is it, right? Surely you can. It's not a matter of if he can, but who are we to make the demands? I wonder sometimes if our heart is not that much different. These are the guys who were longing for the Messiah. He's right in front of them. And they're misunderstanding. Lastly, we see that he was disbelieved and misunderstood and condemned by the Sanhedrin, by the Jewish rulers. The ones who should have seen him coming. Right? It says, when day came, the assembly of the elders of the people gathered together, both chief priests and scribes. And they led him away to their council, and they said, if you are the Christ, tell us. But he said to them, if I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God. So they all said, are you the Son of God then? And he said to them, you say that I am. Then they said, what further testimony do we need? We've heard it ourselves from his own lips. We're getting a picture here, and again, Luke doesn't give all of the steps. It's a bit of a condensed, especially for this Jewish part of the trial, writing predominantly to Gentiles. But we get, even here, hints that these Jewish leaders are trying to add some legitimacy to what has been an illegitimate, kind of illegal proceeding already. The way he was arrested, the way he was held without witnesses, the way he was being questioned, the fact that this was happening at night. So it says when day came, it's like, okay, we can't have an actual trial until daytime. So, okay, sun's up, let's go and have this official hearing so that we can condemn this guy, right? Because we've already decided he's guilty. That's why we've arrested him. We're not actually asking questions. We know we just need to go through the motions, dot the I's, cross the T's, so to speak. Shouldn't he have witnesses in his defense? Not if we can get him to confess himself. So they lead him away and they ask him, if you're the Christ, tell us, are you the Messiah? And I don't know about you, oftentimes when I read this exchange, I'm like, oh, I wish Jesus would just answer them straight. For them and for everyone else who's read this, yes, I'm the Messiah, I'm the one that was to come. Yes, I am the Son of God. Stick that in your pipe and smoke it, as my dad would say. And he doesn't. It's like, why is he being dodgy? He's not being dodgy, but he's not giving them the level of legitimacy they're claiming. They're asking, are you the Messiah? If you're the Messiah, tell us. But he knows why they're asking, how they're asking, right? These are not people saying, Jesus, listen, we've studied all the scriptures, okay? I have been waiting my whole life for the Messiah, for the promised one. My father waited his whole life, his father before him, back generations and generations. The hope of all Israel has been on the one who is to come. And we know the things that you have said and the things that you have done are not normal. You're clearly from God, but we want to know if we put our hope on you or not. Like, are we understanding this clearly? Are you the one that we should be hoping for? There's no genuine questioning and seeking here. These guys had already reached the conclusion. This is not the guy. He can't be. He doesn't fit our boxes. He doesn't fit our categories. He's not one of us. He argues with us. He breaks our rules. So they were asking, they weren't asking because they want to know. They have decided that for him to admit that he claims to be the Messiah, that is just going to be a confession of something that they're going to be able to turn into a crime. Very likely, if he claimed to be the Christ, they would be like, we'll see what the Romans say about you claiming to be the king of the Jews. So he doesn't bite. He doesn't just say, oh yeah, for sure I am, because he's like, you're going to misunderstand. I could answer you clearly and say yes, but you won't, right? If I tell you the truth, you won't believe. If I ask you questions to get you to lay your cards on the table, why do you think the Messiah couldn't be me? He says, you're not going to answer. I've done this before. When I asked you about John's baptism, you're like, by what authority do you do these things? And he said, let me ask you a question about John the Baptist. Was he from God or man? You wouldn't shoot straight with me then. You're playing these political games. You've already decided. So don't pretend like you're asking questions. He says, if I tell you, you won't believe me. If I ask you, you won't answer. This is not a fair procedure by a long shot. You've already decided how it's going to go, and it is going to go your way. And then he says this statement. He says, but from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God. That's kind of mysterious, right? It's like, why would he say that? What does that mean? I think we can know two things about it. There might be more. There's probably depths here. I think on the one hand, Jesus is saying, listen, you've already decided to condemn me. It kind of doesn't matter what I'm going to say. But because this plan has come together and back in the garden, I decided, right? Not my will, but yours be done. Let this cup pass from me. But no, I decided I was going to go through with this, and I've allowed you to arrest me, and I'm right here, and you're condemning me. I have been obedient to my Father, and because of that, I will be glorified. I am enduring this for the joy that's set before me, and he's already looking ahead, right? He says, you're going to find me guilty here. I've already, because of my obedience, been vindicated in a much higher court than you. But I think also it's a statement of condemnation in that I think for Jesus to say this is kind of like saying, listen, guys, your window of opportunity for coming to understand who I am and putting your faith in me has just closed. You've asked me. If I were to answer you, you wouldn't believe me. If I try and explain, I try and have a dialogue with me, you're not going to do that. It's done. From now on, the Son of Man will be glorified. When you see me again, it will be in my glorified state. It will be too late. You can't. This is when you could come and accept. This is when I'm coming in peace. When you see me again, I will not be coming in peace. The door has closed. They don't see it like that. They think Jesus has just handed them, he's made a big blunder. He's just given us it's too good to be true. So when he claims to be the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power of God, they've read Daniel. They're like, hold on, did you just claim to be the Son of God? Like, did you say that again? Say that again for the record. And Jesus says this, you say that I am. That is a tricky one to translate. It sounds like he's being dodgy, right? Well, it's not. The tone of it would be more like, you don't mean what I would mean when I say that, but since you have said that and it's technically correct, I'm not going to deny it. Those are your words. I wouldn't have put it like that, but yes. And it's clear that they did not see it as Jesus dodging. They saw it as a straight up admission, right? Because their response, what more testimony do we need? We've heard it from our own lips. This is so great because technically we would need witnesses. If someone asked, was this trial done according to, we could be like, we didn't even need witnesses. He confessed it himself. Blasphemy. We all heard, you heard that, right? Write that down. Yep, done and done. Thank you for your cooperation. And they condemn him because they already didn't believe. This wasn't a fact-finding, questioning period. This was just them satisfying their own twisted form of external rule-following righteousness in order to condemn the Messiah. I think most of us here don't do that. Not overtly, but I do wonder if it's a similar attitude when we make demands of Jesus based on our small and incomplete understanding of who he is. If there was a God and he was good, he would fill in the blank, right? In my little understanding of the world and right and wrong and time and all of those things, clearly this is the box. And if he doesn't fit this box, I'm not going to believe him, or my faith is really going to be shaken. Instead of asking and listening, we sort of decide what the answer needs to be ahead of time. Do we ask Jesus questions, but we've already settled on the answers? I wonder how many reject his claims to be the Christ and the Son of God because they've already decided that he couldn't be. Those things are impossible. Jesus faced betrayal and rejection from people that he should have been most supported by. And while it's really easy to read this story and point fingers at the characters in the story, right? Judas, the scheming leaders, even frightened Peter, right? What were you thinking? I suspect on some level we all have these same tendencies. The same sort of things lurk in our hearts as did in these folks. And while we might not be actively against him, I wonder, are our hearts divided? I think it can be more subtle. I hope that this passage causes us to pause and examine our own hearts today and this week as we approach Easter. Let's pray together. Gracious Lord, we do thank you for the truth of your word, and we thank you for just the incredible, unbelievable patience and grace of Jesus, the things he suffered on our behalf. Lord, I thank you that grace and patience that you extended to unbelieving hearts and disillusioned hearts and hard hearts back then, you extend it to those kind of hearts today. Lord, I thank you that you see us as we are. We might like to believe that we, like Peter, we are just completely sold out and committed and would never turn our back on you. You see us in our weakness and you still love us. But Lord, I pray that you would help each of us examine our hearts. And that if there are even little bits, just kind of maybe the seeds of some of these attitudes there, Lord, would you show us? Are there ways that we're divided in our loyalties, or we're more afraid of people than we ought to be? Lord, you know. And in your grace, you can show us and give us the strength to grow closer and closer to you. Pray that you would have your way in our hearts. And Lord, if there are those hearing this message, either here or online, and they've not put their faith in you. Maybe they've decided years ago that none of this could possibly be true. These kind of things don't happen. It's just a story. And they have an attitude very similar to the high priests. Lord, I pray that the door wouldn't close on them before you reach them by your Spirit. Open their eyes to the truth of their need of you and what the gospel means, what you did for us. Lord, I pray that you would turn our hearts to you in faith and trust. In Jesus' name.